What are the factors which need to be considered when deciding public policy in the face of a health crisis?
There are several points that should be mentioned in this regard. First of all, the fact that medicine is not an exact science. And this, I think, is broadly recognized and understood. And this, of course, includes epidemiology. And it follows, therefore, that many of the claims, the facts and the figures that have been reported in the multitudinous media channels, social media, newspapers, internet, etc., to which we are all exposed, many of these claims and opinions are exactly that. They are opinions. Many of the predictions either have already proven to have been inaccurate, in some cases perhaps wildly inaccurate. In other cases, in the fullness of time, when all the relevant data is collected and examined thoroughly and objectively, many of those predictions and opinions and claims will prove retroactively to have been mistaken. And therefore it is a fact that even today, after the coronavirus has been in the public eye and has caused widespread illness in many parts of the world for some months, even today, the true, accurate and significant data are still not known. So I believe we are still in the dark to a large extent. And this was certainly true 2 or 3 months ago, when governments around the world had to decide what to do in the face of this looming crisis. And I believe it is certainly true and reasonable to say that at least some of the decisions reached by governments and agencies around the world some months ago, shall we say February 2020, according to the Christian calendar, were reasonable and logical at that point in time, based on known facts and predictions that were placed before those who had to make these decisions. The same is not necessarily true at the present time, in the month of May 2020, because today much more information is available, and some of these predictions and assumptions have been proven to be false. And therefore, some of the criticisms we hear from certain quarters with regards to decisions made some months ago, not all those criticisms are justified, at least in terms of what was known at that time. On the other hand, there are certain factors and realities that can be stated with confidence today, and some of these statements and factors were also equally clear months ago, and these can be raised as part of an assessment of what public policy should be in such situations. Let us begin with the healthcare system in all countries, or most modern Western countries. It is clear that if various types of medical intervention with regards to people who require such intervention, for example, people suffering from cancer or heart disease, etc., if various forms of medical intervention are suspended as a result of the perception and the decision of certain authorities to put all these things on hold whilst trying to deal with the coronavirus, it is clear that this decision carries with it a price tag in human lives. Clearly, some people will have died, if haven't already died, as a result of the suspension of such treatment, and others, because of the general atmosphere of panic, chose not to go to a hospital when they were in need of medical attention. Many such cases have already been reported throughout the world. In one instance, in the United States, a 20-year-old woman was diagnosed by her doctor as suffering from a serious ear infection, and he told her in no uncertain terms that she must go to the emergency room, to the hospital. But because of the general panic, certainly not discouraged by the media, she chose not to do so. She remained at home. This ear infection developed into meningitis, which is something that can happen in certain severe cases of ear infection. And as can sometimes happen with meningitis, this eventually led to her death. Therefore, the decision to turn people away or to create a situation or atmosphere where people opt not to seek medical attention, that itself carries a very serious price tag in terms of human life. It is very difficult, perhaps, to quantify the number of lives lost for this reason, but it is clear, and it has been widely reported, that this is a very real phenomenon. If we now turn to the policy of lockdown, that is to say, governmental policies which lead to an almost complete or near complete cessation of economic activity, this, of course, also of needs carries a very heavy price tag in terms of human lives and quality of life, but first and foremost simply in basic terms of lives lost. For example, the downturn in economic activity in almost all advanced societies will result in the need to slash budgets, including medical budgets. And this, of course, means that there will be fewer funds available to treat the sick, all manner of people requiring medical interventions throughout the industrialized world, where generally there is a high level of medical attention, which includes the purchase of advanced but very expensive medical equipment, which includes all manner of surgery and all manner of advanced and very expensive drugs. People who will no longer be able to access such medical intervention will, without a doubt, many people will pay for this with their lives. Here in Israel, for example, and I assume this is true for most advanced countries, there is a committee which convenes every year to decide on what is known as the basket of medications that will be subsidized by the government. This refers to all types of medications, some of them very new and therefore very expensive. Some of them have been approved for use in human beings but are still somewhat experimental. But there is reason to believe that they save many lives. But obviously, because resources are finite, not all drugs, not all medications, not all interventions can be subsidized and authorized without limit, and therefore decisions have to be made. We will subsidize this particular medication, but not that one. And we are discussing life-saving medications, some of these medications, if not all of them, clearly result in the extension of life. In many cases, people suffering from various diseases, often we're discussing different forms of cancer, but not just cancer. Many types of disease can lead to a rapid decline and death within a relatively short span of time, but with the aid of certain medications, years can be added, sometimes many years can be added to the people suffering from these diseases. And again, these medications can be extremely expensive, and therefore most people would not be able to afford them if they had to pay for them from their own pocket. And therefore the government has to decide which of these medications it will subsidize. If medical budgets are slashed as part of a general reduction in available resources due to the economic downturn, it is clear that decisions will have to be made with regards to the subsidizing of such medications, and many medications that perhaps would have been subsidized, almost certainly would have been subsidized, will no longer be subsidized. The list will have to be shortened. Many medications will have to be dropped. And this will result, inevitably, in the shortening of many people's lives. It needs, therefore, to be understood that the Torah concept, the halachic concept of Pikuach Nefesh, that is to say, the saving of human life, needs to be viewed and understood in a broad and all-encompassing fashion. We cannot limit our examination of such issues to one particular disease and the number of people that it is claimed are dying from that particular disease, which itself is a matter of debate. It is not clear that all people listed in various countries as having died of the coronavirus did in fact die of that cause, of that virus. I won't go into the details, but there are many claims and counterclaims made in this regard. But it is clear that no matter how we count the number of deceased from this particular virus, whatever we do in response to this crisis or similar crises carries a price tag, which also means human lives. Another point to take into consideration: it is generally understood that unemployment leads to loss of human lives. One figure that I have seen for the United States, and I assume this is true for most countries, that is the following: that for every extra percentage point of unemployment, there is an extra percentage point of suicides. It is also a certainty that poverty also carries a price tag of human lives. Unemployment leads to economic hardship in almost all countries, certainly in those countries where the social security net is less generous, shall we say. And therefore, people in that situation tend to defer consulting a physician when they are unwell. They opt not to purchase medications that they may require because they do not have the money to pay for such medications. And again, this, without doubt, leads to the loss of human lives. And therefore, it is a hard and fast rule in sociology and in economics that poverty equals loss of human lives. The more people who fall into what we can broadly describe as living in a state of poverty, the higher the mortality rate amongst such people will be as compared to people who are better off. People who have less money with which to keep body and soul together also tend to eat an inferior diet, which we know also leads to sickness, chronic disease, and death. The same is true for substance abuse. People who are unemployed, who have lost their jobs, whose businesses have collapsed, frequently without any real chance of reviving that business, that endeavor. Such people not only commit suicide, such people fall into depression. A certain percentage certainly become depressed, and a certain percentage certainly turn to substance abuse. And this, of course, also leads to a very high mortality rate. One only has to mention the opioid crisis in the United States and other countries. Therefore, we see that when discussing the human cost of the coronavirus crisis throughout the world, there are many, many parameters and issues that must be considered. And it is my impression that not all of these considerations and aspects of such a crisis and the responses to such a crisis were fully appreciated and taken into account when formulating the various policies and responses. It has also been widely reported in many countries that domestic violence is on the rise as a result of lockdown policies, and this also carries a very high cost in terms of human lives and misery. A further and final point has to do with the disruption of, or even complete cessation of, normal human existence, the functioning of human society, and whether this can be justified, in what circumstances this might be justified. Let us address for a moment the issue of alcohol, the consumption of alcohol. There is no doubt whatever that statistically alcohol can be and must be linked to a certain number of deaths in any society where alcohol is consumed. We all know that there are cases of drunken driving, which frequently leads to death or serious injury. We know that in extreme cases people can die from alcohol poisoning. It cannot be denied that in societies where alcohol is permitted, which is essentially almost all human societies with very few exceptions, there is a certain percentage of people, a very low percentage perhaps, who become alcoholics, or without perhaps being defined officially as alcoholics, drink excessively, which leads to various types of chronic disease, particularly liver disease, which does lead to death. And therefore, one could claim that prohibiting alcohol consumption across the board, without exception, would lead to a saving of human life. And statistically, that would be a correct claim. Factually speaking, this is true. With the exception of relatively few Islamic societies, alcohol has always been a part of human society. Alcohol exists in almost all human cultures. This is a fact that can be confirmed and has been documented for thousands of years, despite the fact that it does, in some cases, lead to mortality or suffering of different forms. It is widely considered to be unreasonable and unwise to try and prohibit the consumption of alcohol completely. We all know there was one attempt in the 1920s in the United States to prohibit the consumption and the sale of alcohol. And we also know that this did not lead to any positive outcome. The only clear and demonstrable outcome was that it very greatly increased the profitability and the reach of the mafia and organized crime. It did not put an end to alcohol consumption, as we know, and therefore the measures, the legal measures against alcohol, what was known as the prohibition, was revoked. And this, I believe, is a correct decision, and this is also what we find in the Torah. The Torah recognizes and accepts the existence of alcohol. The Torah doesn't discuss whiskey, perhaps, or gin, but it certainly discusses wine. And we know that Jews have always consumed wine. We do so also for religious reasons, with regards to Kiddush and Havdalah and weddings, etc. But it is also a fact that, according to the Torah, one must not get drunk. Drunkenness, inebriation, is considered an entirely non-Jewish practice, and it is very, very severely frowned upon, and has never been an issue in traditional Jewish societies. Of course, with perhaps very few individual exceptions, but on a societal level, alcoholism, the abuse of alcohol, has never been a problem in the Jewish world. But that is because the Torah believes in the autonomy of the individual. The Torah also believes that individuals need to be educated and trained to practice moderation. According to the Torah, human life is sacred and unique. And therefore we have in the Torah the concept of Pikuach Nefesh, the saving of human life, which overrides most aspects of the Torah. And that is why we are willing and in fact commanded to even Mahalel Shabbat, to desecrate the Shabbat, the Sabbath, in order to save life. However, it would be a misconception and a misinterpretation of this concept of Pikuach Nefesh if we were to justify on that basis various types of government intervention and regulation with regards to normative human activities and the functioning of society. When considering human life, both of the individual and of society as a whole, we must consider both quantity and quality. Quantity refers to Pikuach Nefesh, the saving of life. Quality refers to the nature and the conditions of human existence. And as we have just explained by way of the example of alcohol, according to the Torah, how the Torah deals with this issue, and for that matter how almost all human societies have chosen to deal with this issue. One cannot justify all and any measure or government intervention that might, or in some cases would certainly result in the saving of a certain number of human lives, even if it is beyond dispute that a certain measure that would curtail some aspects of normative human behavior and the functioning of society would lead to such a result. According to the Torah, it is not justifiable to impinge upon individual freedom, to curtail autonomy, and to disregard the fact that it is the way of the world, the way that Hashem created the world, that individuals are responsible and must be held responsible for their choices, for their behaviors, and that not everything can be legislated and imposed from above. Because human life must also be considered in terms of the quality of that human life, that is to say, the conditions under which people are able to lead their lives, and their ability to be autonomous beings with freedom of choice, who also to be held responsible for their choices and their behaviors. It follows that not everything in human affairs can be viewed in terms of how many lives will be saved or lost by a certain action or by a certain measure. With regards to public policy in times of a health crisis such as the coronavirus, these questions are also relevant, and I imagine, therefore, will be debated and discussed for months and years to come.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.